Whoa, that's loud.
So hot.
So loud. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you to the Colorado Sun for doing this. Big thank you to Jason Blevins for making this topic a thing that we're going to talk about. Blevins is a good man, a good writer. Thanks, buddy. We want to say thanks to our sponsors, including Excel, Auraria, Otten Johnson, and others. Very kind of us to sponsor this really important festival. I want to acknowledge real quick that we are on the land that was traditionally owned by the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Utes. It was their land then. It's shared now. We need to navigate that. Welcome to Psychedelics, Medicalization, and Decriminalization. We have two great people on this panel. Bree is coming from Fort Collins, and she hit traffic, so she said she'll be here in a few minutes. I'm Reilly Capps. I'm a drugs reporter. It's one of the few jobs where they give you a drug test to make sure you've taken enough drugs. I'm now the editorial director of HealingMaps. We're a directory of ketamine clinics and psilocybin retreats, and this is a really exciting time to be in psychedelics. There's so much happening right now, probably as much as at any time since the 1960s or 70s, and an astounding amount is happening right here in Colorado. We have some of the most liberal psychedelic laws in the entire world, and we're going to talk about what that means and how that's affecting our culture and our world and our city. As much as we're known for being the weed state, we were one of the first people to legalize weed, we're known as the psychedelic state, and we're probably going to continue to be. And these two people right here are some of the big reasons why this is moving forward as fast as it is, and I believe in like a really good way. So let me introduce Trav, and we'll introduce Bree when she gets here. Trav is a self-taught mushroom expert who grows some of the best mushrooms in the world, I've heard.
So they say.
He led the 2019 campaign to decriminalize mushrooms in Denver, and people look to him to really understand the mushrooms. He's like the Lorax. Only he doesn't speak for the trees, he speaks for the mushrooms.
Called the Sporax.
The Sporax. So Trav, let's just start with what's hot, which was you were just over at a psychedelic convention across the street, like literally just now. Tell me about that. What was that like?
A few months ago, we had MAPS come through here, and there were 13,000 people that descended on Denver that are really interested in the research, the industry behind psychedelics. So I would call what I just came from a pocket version of what that was, and didn't have nearly the casino vibes as the MAPS conference did, but there are a lot of people looking to stake their claim in this promised industry coming down the pipeline.
MAPS is this, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, Pharmaceutical Studies now. And they're trying to get MDMA-assisted psychotherapy approved by the FDA, and our next panelist, Bree, is working on that. So yeah, so they had this big panel back in the spring, and now these people have this panel, and you said they're just selling mushrooms openly?
So in the exhibition hall, yeah, they're just openly selling mushrooms.
And no one gave them any gruff? No one seemed to care at all?
Not yet.
What do you mean, not yet?
Well, I wasn't there to see any policing.
Oh, okay.
But our law clearly says that there's no sales. One of the booths, their workaround is that you buy a crystal for $60, and then you get the mushrooms for free.
And we've seen this in weed. It's the way it is in Washington, D.C., right? You buy a T-shirt, and then you get weed. You kind of led the charge against turning these things into commodities. Like, you're very much a believer in these things having a higher purpose. They shouldn't just be turned into tomatoes or concrete or just any other thing that you buy on the street, right?
Yes.
And why is that? What's going on?
I see the mushroom as a sentient being. The mushroom has been working with me for 28 years now, and 24 of those years I had a drug relationship with the mushroom, which we call recreation now. And it wasn't until I started going to the mushroom intentionally that I realized it is so much more intelligent than we are. And when you think about personhood in that way, you know, how can we commodify that? You know, how can we continually subject these things to extractive capitalism? And like I said, this is my perception that it's so much more intelligent than I am.
Would you compare it to like a dog or a cat in terms of like we wouldn't necessarily just sell dogs and cats in the store? We have sort of ideas around how they should be treated?
Again, I'm going to platform it above human intelligence. So think of it that way. I mean, of course, we are buying and selling cats and dogs. You know, we've commodified that. But yeah, journeying with the mushroom, inner work, has really revealed to me that there is a lot more going on than the story that we've been handed. And I really believe that we're only going to be able to get so far down this path without bringing the indigenous back to the conversation, that we need the wisdom that is within lineage traditions to be able to contextualize a lot of these experiences that people are going to be having. And as long as we treat this as a psychologized relationship or an individualized relationship, we're only going to get so far unless we address the systems that are oppressing us and causing these problems.
What do you mean by that?
Has anybody in here read the book Brave New World? So, dystopian kind of picture that kind of depicts a caste system that people can't get out of. And it's basically a shit show, but everybody takes this drug called soma. And when someone's having an off day, they say, have you taken your soma yet? So it's something that allows us to be more well-adjusted to the shit show. And a really wise dude named Krishnamurti once said, it's no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a sick society. So as long as we're putting these medicines in the context that we're only healing the problems of the individual, we're only going to get so far.
Do you think mushrooms can be used to heal the ills of society?
With intention and reverence.
How do we do that?
Well, like I said, it took me 24 years to flip the switch between a drug relationship and realizing I was dealing with something a lot bigger than my ability to comprehend. And I don't know how to plant that seed and have it grow into a sprout very quickly in everybody, because we all come to this medicine from a different place, a different way of understanding. A lot of our programming and our biases and our identities keep us from seeing something in that way. So the answer to your question is, I don't know, other than to meet people where they're at and to constantly be the voice of the, would you say the Lorax? The Sporax.
The Sporax.
And in a really visible way, so that the way I've been talking about it is that we're going to need healing from healing, which is a really interesting concept, because unless we are dealing with colonialism and human-centric philosophy, we're not actually going to address the symptoms that we're dealing with.
So how do we bring in, we know indigenous cultures have used these things for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the peyote cultures, the ayahuasqueros. How do we bring in that wisdom if there just aren't that many of them? They're not up here. How do we do that?
We need to create spaces that are safe enough for wisdom to present itself, first and foremost. We need to go out of our way to build bridges to those communities, and appreciate that there are hundreds, if not thousands of years of oppressive behavior to have to rectify. And sometimes that means you have to sit outside the gates of that process for a long, long, long time to show that you are ready.
Sit outside the gates of which process?
Of being able to hear wisdom and not extract it.
So sit with the indigenous wisdom for a long time before you start to say, okay, here's how we bring the indigenous wisdom into this new model of giving psychedelics in a clinical way?
No, I mean, we need to posture ourselves in such a way that we are showing that we are ready to listen, to become deep listeners
To the indigenous
to the indigenous wisdom,
and the mushroom wisdom.
I believe.
So you decriminalized, you were the leader of the campaign in 2019 to decriminalize mushrooms. It made it so you could grow your own. Then there was this thing, Prop 122, the National Medicine Health Act, which was passed in November of 2022, and you opposed that. That's going to bring the mushrooms more into our culture than ever before. It's going to set up these healing centers where you're going to be able to go and take them with a trained facilitator. They're going to have preparation and integration sessions. People are going to be looked after. And you opposed that bill. Why did you oppose that?
I felt that it was moving too fast. There were a group of us that worked on the campaign that were in agreement that when the statewide effort came up, that the statewide iteration came up, that we would all work together. And a couple of backdoor deals happened, and an out-of-state organization ran a poll in Colorado. I think it cost them $40,000 to determine if Colorado was politically viable, meaning that they could run a campaign and win. So this organization, once they saw that they were polling in over 50%, they said, we're going to run this campaign whether you like it or not. And originally, their initiative did not contain any decriminalization elements at all. And we did our best to rally the community that was concerned about this to the table. And our number one ask is that this process please slow down. Please, let's just wait till the next election cycle so that we can get to know each other and we can actually draft legislation that will show that we put a lot of thought and a lot of integrity into it, and that we did the math ahead of time. And they said no. And then the next thing that we asked for was a zero limit decriminalization. So anytime that you set limits, you allow for policing. And we can look historically that marginalized populations are policed way more than white populations. So we wanted to say that there is absolutely no reason that a police officer should be able to police at all. When you set a limit like 4 grams, the cop can look at something and say, well, I need to take that from you and put it on a scale. So we were really holding that line really hard.
And you won that one. There are no limits right now.
Well, so what they did is they wrote in that a person can have a necessary amount to share, which actually causes policing because it gives the police officer the opportunity to determine what's necessary. In Denver, we've been living in no-limit decrim for the last 4 years. So a police officer is going to look at an ounce of mushrooms entirely different as an officer in Summit County is going to look at an ounce of mushrooms. And the difference between a necessary amount to share being okay for personal use and a felony distribution is up to the discretion of the police officer. So that's one of the other things that we were rallying really hard against, is this is way too vague. You know, we need something a lot more concrete so that the burden of policing doesn't fall on a police officer that has opinion.
And how about the healing centers, these places where you're going to be able to go and take mushrooms? What's your worry about them?
My concern is that we have something, we'll talk about the cost of compliance, right? Because it's still federally Schedule I substance, the IRS will not allow you to write off any of your expenses. So right from the rip, you're making services twice as expensive. I'm just going to borrow from Oregon a little bit because they seem to be the test case for how things could roll out here. And they told the voters that the taxpayers would not have to burden the fees for this system, and that the licenses would actually pay for the cost of everything. They think it's going to cost about $3 million a year to run, and only $348,000 worth of licenses were sold. So they've already gone to the Oregon taxpayers and said to them, we need $6 million worth of subsidizing to run this program. And the very quick response was, why would we subsidize services that are only going to apply to the wealthy? Because it looks like for $2,500, you're going to be able to take a handful of mushrooms with someone that has at least a high school diploma and has passed a 120-hour certification. So my biggest concern is that we have underqualified people working with these medicines. I often bring up the story of the sorcerer's apprentice, depicted in Disney's Fantasia. Mickey Mouse is the sorcerer's apprentice, and the sorcerer goes away and tells Mickey to clean up. And instead of doing the work himself, Mickey casts a spell to animate a broom and goes and takes a nap. And when he wakes up, he realizes that the broom has run amok and done way too much, so he starts casting more spells. And before he knows it, all hell has broken loose. And then the sorcerer shows back up and says, oh my gosh, I just asked you to clean up, and like, look at all this. So one of my biggest concerns is because we don't have a context for what these medicines and the mechanisms that they work in, that we're going to create problems that we can't anticipate.
Meaning people getting spun? Spun meaning...
That's the whole thing, I can't anticipate it.
Spun means like you take too much, you start talking too much, you get a little manic, but you just think you can't anticipate it. We don't know what these things are going to do.
Well, I'm going to borrow from herbalism here, and each one of our bodies holds these medicines differently. So someone that can take a gram, someone else can take the same gram and end up in a place 4 times as out there. And this is like, I really wish that we had slowed down this process to bring in a lot more indigenous wisdom to contextualize a lot of this stuff and figure out how it's going to roll out.
Let's talk about successes, because you've been out in the community since decrim 4 years ago. You educate, you are a death doula, you sit for people who...
Call it end-of-life doula now.
End-of-life doula. You sit for people who are making the transition into the end of life. You help them with mushrooms to get past their anxiety, to see maybe that there's something bigger than themselves. What are some of the successes that you've seen just out in a decrim environment?
When something's criminal, there's a lot less likely for people to be visible and to come and share their stories. And when we all share our stories, we get a much more comprehensive cultural understanding of what something is or what something isn't. So on a meta level, I see that one of the greatest successes is just the wisdom that has been sequestered all over the place in Colorado can actually come out and become visible. And not only that, but there's a synthesis happening. You know, people that have been working with these medicines for 30, 40 years are able to meet one another. And I believe there's a lot of things a lot of beautiful things that we can't even begin to anticipate what happens when wisdom meets wisdom.
Can you tell us about somebody maybe you worked with that has seen their life changed?
I supported somebody in a journey that had been dealing with depression and alcoholism their whole life. The alcoholism was probably a symptom of the depression. And on a high-dose psilocybin journey, it was revealed to her that when she was in the womb, Castro was taking over Cuba, and her mom was watching people die all over Cuba and was so fearful for her to be born that she was imprinted with that fear. And I watched it become part of her conscious awareness, and then I watched her process it. And I'm friends with this woman, but it's been beautiful to see that she hasn't had a drink of alcohol in the last 3 years on the heels of that experience, because the unconscious became conscious. One of the more powerful journeys that I've had the opportunity to participate in, but that was pretty profound. I think I myself received a lot of healing in that, just appreciating the mechanisms that the medicine can work through. You know, before that, I never would have conceived that could have happened.
Is there a difference between taking them, say, at a concert and taking them in that intentional way?
Intention directs attention. So whenever you take something like this, a lot of things may just pop up by happenstance. But when you go and work with these medicines intentionally, it's the beginning of a conversation. And the medicine responds to you and works with you.
What do you think the medicine wants? You talk to it a lot? Do you think it has an agenda, or do they want to make needs? Do they want to be beautiful truffula trees?
So
what do they want?
Through an indigenous lens, there is a group of organisms, plant and fungi, maybe animals that we're aware of, that are master teachers. So I can't begin to speak about their agenda, but I will say that I trust the mushroom's guidance more than any other human being that I've ever encountered. And sometimes they're really hard on me, but I trust that. I trust their way of teaching.
I want to welcome to the stage Brianna Bendixsen. Thanks for coming, Bree. Sorry about the traffic. Good to have you. Bree is a psychedelic psychotherapist at Reflective Healing in Fort Collins, where she does ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And she was a therapist on a momentous study just published that paves the way for the FDA to approve MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. That just came out. It was an incredibly positive paper. Can you tell us some of the things that you saw in that study when you were working as a therapist?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here, and I apologize. Good? Better?
Yep.
Great. Apologize for being late. Had a first session this morning facilitating a medicine session with a client. We can't always guarantee when they're going to be ready to go. So thank you so much for your patience with me. As far as what I saw in the MDMA study, so I actually began as the study coordinator back in 2017. And back then, nobody knew really what we were doing, and late 2017 we were designated breakthrough status by the FDA, and so I've really been kind of with our team, from the very beginning, from the start of phase 3 studies. And then in 2019 I started as a therapist on the study as well, and it was absolutely incredible just to see the transformation of our participants really, really right before our eyes. And with the help of the medicine, our participants were really able to dive into some pretty heavy trauma. But not only just the trauma itself, but really were able to shift into a place not just accepting the trauma or healing the trauma, but actually recognizing that it was part of their story. And rather than curing what happened, right, we can't change it, they recognized to own that part of their story and really find power in their experience and their place in the world, given the experiences they had gone through.
Can you tell us about one particular person that sticks out in your mind?
Yes. So one of our participants it was her second medicine session. Just to give a really quick overview for those who aren't familiar, we do 20 sessions total in the MDMA study, and only 3 of those are medicine sessions. The rest of them are traditional psychotherapy and assessments for research. And so the 3 medicine sessions are 8 hours long. And so in this participant's second medicine session, she had really experienced some really terrible early childhood abuse from the time that she was very little all the way up through her teen years. Really horrific sexual abuse in particular. And in one of these sessions, just with the help of the medicine, And at that point, we didn't know that it was active medicine. This was the placebo-controlled, but we were fairly certain by that point, but you never know. And anyway, in one of these sessions, she had this re-experiencing of a particular sexual trauma, and she stood up, and she wanted us, me and my co-therapist, she wanted us to hold a couch cushion. And she was processing re-experiencing this event, but instead of being a young child and not able to fight this person off, we held up couch cushions for her, and she just wailed on them. And then she kind of, not pretended, but acted like she was kind of like hitting him in the head and punching him and with these couch cushions. And it really only lasted a few minutes, but that allowed the trauma to move out of her body with these physical motions that she wished she would have been able to do at that time. That cycle of trauma in her body was able to be completed. That was probably one of the most powerful, intense, beautiful, miraculous experiences probably across the participants that I've worked with.
And for people that don't know, MDMA, it's ecstasy or Molly. What does it feel like when you're on that medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So MDMA, or sometimes known as ecstasy or Molly, for most people tends to elicit feelings of euphoria, feeling more trusting, open, compassionate towards oneself and others. And in the therapy context, it looks a lot different than, let's say, at a festival or a party, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with what that could look like in a recreational setting, and I do think that there's some power in those settings as well, in community and with safe, trusted friends. But in the therapy room, our participants are laying down on a sofa and have their eyes covered with eye shades, for those of you who might be familiar with what that setup looks like, and then they're wearing headphones. And participants alternate between what we call going inside, and that means going inward with their eyes covered, and doing some inward reflection. And we are not directing the process. We encourage them to follow whatever comes up. And so what that tends to look like in the therapy session in MDMA is perhaps revisiting a particular traumatic experience, or sometimes not. Sometimes it doesn't come up. Maybe the trauma doesn't come up until the second or third session. Sometimes it's just re-experiencing early childhood memories, fun trips with family, or playing in the neighborhood with their friends, and really feeling like they're re-experiencing that and being able to connect with those sensations of joy. And then in our work with the therapists, participants will periodically come out, meaning they'll kind of take off the eye shades and begin to process with us. And usually, more often than not, there is a deep, deep feeling of trust and connection with the therapist. They're not feeling guarded. They're able to freely talk about some of these experiences without the kind of filter that some of us have when we're in traditional talk therapy.
And the measurement, these were all people with PTSD.
Yes.
And so the measurement, you took their scores before and after. And in this most recent paper, about 2/3 of the people who had PTSD no longer qualified for having that diagnosis after.
Yes, that's correct.
An extraordinary thing.
It's phenomenal, yep. And it's also not, the numbers are fantastic, and in our first phase 3 study, 68% of people no longer met criteria for PTSD, and in the second part, the second phase, it was about 72%. But also what that means in one's own life, right? The numbers are important, but what I see clinically, personally, is a sense of being able to interact with people in the world, being able to go to the grocery store without fear, being able to hang out and play with their kids. And again, like I spoke to a minute ago, just recognizing that trauma is part of them, but it doesn't define them. And that really dramatically changes the quality of their life.
Super hopeful. And so this, if the FDA approves it, which it seems likely that they will, how will that show up in our lives? How will we be able to take MDMA now?
That's a great question. So because we received breakthrough status early on, the phase 3 trial is now complete. Right now, the FDA is reviewing all of our data, safety data, assessments, protocol, all of that. And the plan, the goal, we'll see how this goes, but assuming all goes according to plan and there's no big hang-ups with the FDA, we should be able to have access to legal MDMA use in the clinic by next year.
So they'll get a doctor's prescription, they'll go take it with a therapist like yourself, they'll do a preparation and integration session. That seems like a win.
Yeah.
That seems like a giant thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And, we aren't totally sure what that looks like yet. We do know that it will be 2 therapists in the room, and it will be MDMA will be prescribed for use in the clinical setting. And it will follow, as far as we know at this point, will follow the protocol. But what I'm really looking forward to is the ability to be flexible, because in our study, we have people who meet criteria for severe PTSD. But hopefully, at some point in the near future, we'll be able to offer 1, 2 medicine sessions, maybe for people who maybe they don't need 3, or maybe there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of other factors in one's life and maybe they need 4 or 5. And so I'm really looking forward to having the flexibility outside of the clinical protocol.
We've been talking about mushrooms, that's what Trav's into. How do you think MDMA will fit in with this psychedelic scene in the future?
That's a great question. I am hopeful, and Rick Doblin, who's the founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, who we're running this study through, Rick will speak about having psychedelic clinics. And I'm looking forward to this because I think in the future, hopefully, we will have people who are trained in multiple types of medicine. And so, for example, I personally work with ketamine and MDMA. I have other colleagues of mine who are very very knowledgeable and trained in working with mushrooms. Other clinicians, wonderful clinicians, are trained with working with other medicines. And so my hope is that we will see psychedelic clinics where people have access to various types of medicine. Personally, I think ketamine is a wonderful medicine to introduce somebody to the psychedelic experience. And again, this is just my own personal belief, but starting someone with ketamine to kind of just see what the water's like. Let's see what this feels like in your body, and then move on to other psychedelics that might be appropriate. That's how I see it fitting in. What do you think? Did you answer this question already?
Ask the question again.
Oh, just how do you see MDMA fitting in? Or even more broadly, because MDMA is likely going to be legal, mushrooms are certainly going to be legal. These other medicines like mescaline, ibogaine, and DMT are all legal now in Colorado for personal use, and there's likely to be these clinics where you can take, 6 different medicines? Ketamine, MDMA, mushrooms, mescaline, DMT, ibogaine. How do you see them all fitting together, or not?
Well, at first, I think it's going to be kind of like going to a restaurant and looking at a menu and kind of just deciding to try them one by one from the user standpoint. They all have their gifts. They have their prescriptive applications, they have their scope. And a lot of these compounds, medicines, substances have overlapping scopes. So I think it's just going to be, experience is going to create emergent phenomena as to how we assess individuals and bring them to the medicine.
Do you think for either of you, different medicines are good for different things, different people?
I do. I think that MDMA has a tendency to meet people in a much easier place than some of the other natural medicines that are going to be included. People are the fear complex is so interrelated to control, and we don't like to lose the feeling of control. And a lot of these medicines, the kind of way they disorient us, it relieves us of that need to control everything. And what I like about MDMA, and I've never used it in a therapeutic sense, although I would say my recreation is very therapeutic, that it just met me in a very gentle place and just opened me up. And put me in a very trusting place. I remember the first time I did MDMA, I actually called my mom and I said to her, I get you. This whole time, I'm like 30 years old and I finally get you. I understand what unconditional love is. And I think that was pretty profound. And I did tell her that I was on a substance, and she did make fun of me for the next year because of that. But we're pretty tight, and eventually we came to a place where we recognized the healing in that. That I was able to actually see her.
Bree, what do you think? How are you gonna, someone comes to you and says, oh, I have this problem, and you can use all 6 of those medicines. How are you gonna, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I agree. I think MDMA is easier, a little bit more gentle than some of the classic psychedelics. For someone who comes to me with, so my specialty in general is working with trauma, and what I've seen on the MDMA studies is I really believe in using MDMA for trauma. As far as depression, we know psilocybin mushrooms are really helpful. Ketamine can be helpful. And some of the other medicines, for example, ibogaine, we know can be really supportive for folks working through addiction. And some of the medicines that were legalized are not my area of expertise. And so I really believe in I believe, at least for my own experience and profession, is really kind of being heavily steeped in 1 or 2 or a few of the medicines, but it takes time to develop relationships with each one, and they all have a different personality. They all have a different signature. So I'm not sure if I could speak to the others that are included there.
But you might say, okay, I'm good at MDMA. I know it's good for PTSD, but if you have alcoholism, I might send you to an iboga practitioner.
Yeah.
We're going to open it to questions in about 7 minutes. I want to hear from you guys, what is just really big in your mind as you're out there doing your work? What's just oh my gosh, I think about this all the time. Either positively, negatively, oh my gosh, I'm surprised by this. This is so hopeful, I'm so scared of this. Just what's really big in your life, in your work?
I teach a microdosing class every Monday, and I'm really big on what we'll call the abundance model. I charge a very low price, and I give away the medicine. And when I was poking around and looking at similar services, I saw, we'll just say I charge $30, and I was poking around and I saw that people charge anywhere from $200 to $2,000 for the same thing that I do. And something I talk about a lot is that the psilocybin mushroom is very abundant, and we are going to corral it into these models where we're going to really get top dollar for something that's essentially free. The Johns Hopkins study gives participants 25 milligrams of psilocybin to, in their words, they call it occasion a mystical experience. And granted, I already bought all the lab stuff to do it, but it cost me 43 cents to produce that dose. So it really just blows me away how much these associated costs are going to be to work with something that's so abundant, so ridiculously abundant.
Because we're going to have all this overhead, oversight, government regulation, licenses.
In Oregon, the mushrooms have to be transported by armored car because the armored car company has to get their money. So.
And in Oregon, there are already 3,000 people on the waiting list for the first center that has opened.
Yep.
Bree, how about you? What's just really big in your field of view?
Yeah, so just building off of the price point there, what was coming up for me is, I think this follows our Western model, right? Like take a pill, you can just pay however much you can for it. Right now it's, in Oregon, the prices are just astronomical, it's ridiculous. But it's this idea that all of these things are outside of ourself. And while I do definitely believe in the medical model for some folks, and maybe that's a good entry point for a lot of folks, I also believe in our personal power of healing ourselves. And so sometimes I have to, when I'm working with people, I remind them that yes, you're ingesting this substance, MDMA, ketamine, but all of these experiences are coming from within you. And we're following the participants, the client's lead. And so what I hope to see in the future, and what I'm excited about, a little nervous about, all of the above, is that more and more people are accepting of psychedelic medicines and starting to experiment, hopefully safely, but maybe not, experiment on their own. And I see a lot of power in that, in folks kind of taking back their power, right? Not needing to go to not always needing to rely on the therapist, or not needing to rely on this external model, but really finding that the healing is coming from within themselves. I'm not sure if that was on line with your question.
Yeah, one of the core tenets of traditional Chinese medicine is that the body knows how to heal itself.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just needs to be reminded. So oftentimes, I borrowed this from a gentleman named Kalindi, who would take 50 grams of mushrooms at a time, but he viewed the mushroom as a mnemonic device, something that helps us remember. So as you were kind of saying that, talking about the body's innate ability to heal itself, and we've just become infantilized to these systems that have convinced us that we need to have these external influences to initiate that process.
You often say you are the medicine. We are the medicine. I'm the medicine, you are the medicine, Bree's the medicine. Everyone in the audience is the medicine.
Yep.
And Bree has this knowledge, or this conception of the inner healer, right? You're trying to get people in touch with something that we all have inside of us.
Yep.
That heals us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
On that note, let's open it up to questions. Are you guys good for questions?
Yeah, I love
Okay.
questions.
Absolutely.
Great.
Keep it in my
Excited to hear what you guys want to know about.
Thanks, and thanks for the presentation. I want to go back to your study that you submitted to the FDA. In my reading, one of the difficulties on these studies is how do you know about a placebo group, or the control group, if you will. And I'm also curious, two more things, if I'm permitted to ask multi-questions. One is, was there any then, if it was just the medications, what does that say about psych being a contributing factor in terms of helping people? And over the time that you were using or gave the medication, was there a duration of impact that you saw?
Yeah, so the first question was about the placebo group, and if I'm hearing your question correctly, so the MAPS phase 3 trial is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. And for those who are more familiar with psychedelics, the question often comes up like, don't you know if they're an active medicine or placebo? And the answer is often, but not always. And we treat every participant as though they're getting the medicine regardless. And we've seen this across studies, not just in our phase 3 study for PTSD, but this goes back all the way. The first studies were in 2000. And what the research shows, what we saw in the therapy is that a good portion, oftentimes the participant thought that they got medicine or they didn't think if it was placebo. But we did have a number of participants across all sites. There were 12 sites nationwide. We had a number of participants that thought that they received placebo. Therapists thought they received placebo and they received the active medicine. And we had a number of participants across all sites that received the placebo and the therapist and the participant thought that they received active medicine. And the placebo effect is really interesting, right? Is because a lot of these participants come in with, they're hopeful, right? It's a somewhat self-selecting group. The enrollment criteria is pretty strict. It's pretty rigorous screening process, but for the most part, if they did get into the study, participants were really hopeful that they were going to be able to access this medicine. They wanted to dive in, they wanted to do the work, and so it actually ended up, sometimes it didn't matter if it was active medicine or not. Did that answer your question about the placebo? Yeah.
Because a lot of the people who didn't get the medicine still no longer qualify for having PTSD.
Yes.
It's still a pretty high number.
Yeah, and Reilly had shared that many of the participants who didn't receive active medicine, who received the placebo, still no longer met criteria for PTSD. The second question that you had was about the therapy process in the... Yeah. So what the therapy looks like in the trial is really, so all of the therapists are trained in various modalities. My training, like I had mentioned, I'm trained in trauma, TFCBT. Some of the therapists are trained in other modalities, EMDR, DBT. So in line with just kind of normal clinical practice, we use our clinical therapy skills as we see fit. You kind of pull whatever out of your tool bag that works in that moment. But in particular, the kind of hallmark of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is following the participant's direction, the non-directive or inner-directed healing approach. And what that means is, actually it was kind of humbling to me when I first started doing this work, is dropping our own agenda and following the participant's lead, trusting that they have the answers within and we're following their lead and where the medicine is taking them, and we are not asking them to, okay, let's talk about this now, or it is also challenging sometimes to let go of what we think they need and just trust that we're following them. The last thing I'll say about this is MDMA is also very forgiving. So sometimes the therapist may say, it sounds like you're describing this, or it sounds like this is related to this early childhood experiences, and on MDMA participants like, nope, that's not right. No, I don't want to talk about that. We're going to go this way. We're like, okay, great, sounds good. And that's actually really a beautiful part of the work, right, is the participant, again, really kind of taking ownership over the process and trusting that the therapist can follow their lead rather than them following us. I'm sorry, duration. All of the numbers that we said, the 68% in the first phase and the 72%, that was at the 1-year follow-up.
Hello. Bree, you mentioned that when participants are in a therapy session that there is an increased amount of trust and then in turn also decreased inhibition, which creates an opportunity for abuse and coercive control. This has been covered by the New York Magazine in their podcast cover story, and I was just wondering what kind of guardrails are being put in place to protect against this type of thing, and then also I'm curious as to how you determine dosage, and if there is a network of practitioners to communicate about dosage and those types of things.
Those are both great questions. The first one about safety, the New York Magazine cover story podcast. So years ago, there was a therapist that worked on the MDMA study. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'll just give you some context. That there was some sexual abuse that happened to the participant by the therapist. The therapist and the participant had entered into a relationship. The therapy was done, but the whole study process was not. And so sometimes you'll hear conflicting messages about this, and it is absolutely not appropriate that this happened, and those therapists were removed immediately from the study as soon as that information came out. The one point I like to mention about the Cover Story podcast is while a lot of the facts that were presented were true, and it's horrific that that happened to a participant, and I don't want to negate that by any means, but it is filed under True Crime Podcast, and it was sensationalized for the purpose of listens, for the purpose of really, I mean, first off, it's great that this conversation is happening. I'm glad that it is. But I was also a little bit disappointed that they didn't talk about harm reduction measures, how to educate potential participants or clients about warning signs, things to look out for to make sure that you are working with someone who you can trust. So that's the only kind of note that I would make about the podcast. As far as in the study, we talk about physical contact before the MDMA sessions start. We always name that any physical contact, touch for safety, touch for support, is always non-sexual, and it does not look like some of the videos that came out about that provider in the earlier studies. That typically looks like a handhold, usually like a handshake, a hand on the shoulder. Sometimes if the participant, at the participant's request, it might be like sitting next to them on the couch with an arm around them. And at every single point, they know, before, during, and after the sessions, that if they want that physical contact, then they are welcome to ask for it. If they no longer want it, we educate them and teach them about consent, right? Also empowering them to learn how to ask for and also withdraw any physical contact. And then after the sessions, we talk about if there was that contact, was that okay? And it's an open conversation during every session, always. And those are kind of the guardrails that you mentioned that we use. And again, it's like MDMA can elicit those feelings of openness and trust, trust, and it's also a huge responsibility on the therapist to make sure that they are acting in their highest ethical integrity, right? It's like if a participant wants to cuddle, or we offer alternatives to, okay, where's that feeling in your body? What's where in your body? What are you looking for? And how might we offer alternatives that perhaps are more appropriate for the therapeutic context? And you had another question too, but I don't want to take up all of it. Oh, so the dose is determined. There's been a number of pharmacokinetic studies. I don't know what like dose finding studies, and the doses are standard across all three sessions. So the first session, the participant will get 80 milligrams of MDMA and then a booster of 40 milligrams, and that's a bit on the lower end. And then in the second and third sessions, the participants will get 120 milligrams and then a booster of 60. And that's just standardized across all of the studies that are happening now. There were a number of studies to figure out what kind of the optimal dose was. And the reason that we don't do like an active placebo, low dose, is because those earlier studies showed that a very low dose of MDMA can actually elicit more anxiety, more fear, more activation.
And is that the same for psilocybin?
So, as far as the studies are concerned, so the metric they've been running with is 25 milligrams per 160 pounds, which is like 3.5 grams of regular mushrooms. And that's what they've been going with.
Part of the reason I asked is I heard a psychotherapist talking at the Telluride Mushroom Festival 2 years ago, whose therapeutic dose was 7 grams. And then participants were opting out of their sessions. Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Not everybody is built to take that kind of a dose. It's just not. There's like a point of diminishing return. You know, if you're basically subtly traumatizing or overtly traumatizing somebody with too high a dose. And I think that is just like a feature of how we colonize these things, that the person that's giving those 7 grams, probably 7 grams worked for them, so they think that 7 grams is going to work for everybody. And I think I kind of like fell into that trap a little early on. My first intentional dose was in the vicinity of 15 grams. And then I just figured like, oh wow, everybody could benefit from that. And I didn't realize like that's harmful. And to really meet people where they're at and to educate people that the medicines are consensual and that they can move at the speed of trust with them. You know, we don't have to start at 7. We could do 2 all day long until you either that's good or you can opt into like a higher dose. Moving at that level of trust. Yeah, 7 grams is too much for most people. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because there's only so much you can get. Like when you have to just deal with that much disorientation in that way, like why would you want to go back to that? You know, there's a lot of mechanisms that the medicine is working through that sometimes you don't need to hear the message at that volume. You know, you could have taken a gram and gotten the same message. You know, I've seen people successfully quit drinking and smoking cigarettes on a gram of mushrooms. They didn't need to take 7 to do that, but that person probably felt that 7 was the trick. So,
I think this speaks to our culture of more, right? And more is not always better.
Hey, Brianna. So the medicine is in us, and the medicine is in you, and it's in me. And the psychedelic gives us a way to access that medicine, find the healing power of our body. And then you also said earlier that you hope maybe this process can fuel people to experiment on their own. Are there people in the psychotherapy community that see this as an existential threat? Because what you just described in my head, I'm thinking, I could go one time, sit with you, and then go home, work on it. You know, medicine is in me, I'm accessing it. I might not need psychotherapy ever again. You know, and that's not what Sigmund Freud taught us, right? Like you're proposing something that could be interpreted as an existential threat to the entire world of psychotherapy, in a way. Maybe? No?
yeah.
Reading too much.
Who do you want to answer that question?
Both of you guys.
I would love for the goal to be to work myself out of a job, right? My goal is not for people to continually need to come back. My goal is for, personally, I love working with people long term, and my hope for people that I work with is that they then trust in themselves that they have the answers within. Unfortunately, the rate of trauma and depression and mental health conditions, given our culture and our just state of our world right now, it seems pretty far off that we'll be working ourselves out of a job. But ultimately, yeah, right, the goal is to be able to help people, give them the support that they need, trust in themselves that they have the answers within. And I would love for everybody to have some experiences sitting with a therapist before they try using medicines recreationally, but that's not that's just kind of my hope. I like safety and appropriate education, but my hope is that people will feel safe and empowered and educated enough to be able to experiment on their own.
So the one dose thing is interesting. I guess it depends on the level of self-exploration you want to participate in. If you the phone rings, you get the message, and you hang up, I think that a lot of people are going to fall into that category. But I think that some of these experiences are going to seed the notion that there is a lot more going on here, and that this economic viability model that we are participating in is not the way it could be. And when you're talking about an existential threat, people are waking up to the notion that there is a lot more going on than we've been traditionally handed to, that we are participating in a form of wage slavery, and why are we doing that? So yeah, I do see this as an existential threat, but then what do we do with that? What do we do with those people that are awakening, And a lot of these things that tie us to our spirituality are going to become vestigial models, because we're going to have direct experience models that are replacing faith-based models. So that's what I see.
Let's do one more.
Oh, hey. Hi, this is for you, Bree. You talked about 3 sessions for the MDMA therapy. What is the interval between those? Is it standard, or it depends on the patient?
Sorry, what was the what between?
The intervals for the 3 sessions, is it a standard thing, or is it based on the patient?
Yes, so in the clinical trial, if we're talking with MDMA, it's 3 to 5 weeks. It's about a month in between each session. It is standardized, and so there's like very specific timelines when each appointment has to happen. That's the research protocol. Clinically, what we'll hopefully see in the future is there's going to be a lot more flexibility with that. And that might look like maybe 3 sessions and then another one 6 months later. We don't have that flexibility yet, but in the trials, with MDMA, 1 month in between each MDMA session, and 3 sessions total.
I want to thank everybody so much for coming out. I'm going to say one more thing, and that is that any medicine, it depends on the dose, and it depends on the use. If you do tobacco in a ceremonial way, in a Native American way, and you do it once a month, it's not a problem. If you smoke a pack a day, you're going to die of cancer. Same with opioids, same with sugar, same with all kinds of things. It's up to all of us to find a right relationship with any medicine that we're working with, whether that's MDMA, psilocybin, with ourselves, with our friends, with nature, something higher. It's all up to us to find that right relationship, find our own inner healer, and find our North Star if possible. So I want to say big thank you to Bree for coming to the meeting, coming all the way down from Fort Collins. Thank you so much. Trav, thank you for all the work you do in the community and to free us so that we can do our work. I want to say thanks to the Colorado Sun, to the Auraria campus, and to everybody that came. Thanks, Blevins, for setting this up, and we will see you guys soon.
Thank you.